Okay, good afternoon and thank you for joining us for this webinar on how to apply the MYAN National Youth Settlement Framework to set service delivery. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we are all on today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I would now like to welcome and introduce our guest speakers. So firstly, we have Carmel Guerra, who is the founder and chief executive officer for the Centre of Multicultural Youth, the first and largest organisation in Australia to work exclusively with migrant and refugee young people. Carmel is widely recognised for her knowledge and advocacy on multicultural youth issues. She has served on numerous boards and committees and is the chairperson of the Multicultural Youth Advocacy Network, MYAN Australia, the national peak body representing multicultural youth issues. Carmel is also a member of the Youth Parole Board of Victoria, the Victorian Children's Council, Migration Council of Australia, and SBS Community Advisory Committee. Carmel was awarded a Medal of Order of Australia in 2016 for services to multicultural youth in Victoria and the Victorian Premier's Award for Community Harmony in 2015. So thank you, Carmel, for joining us today. I'll just briefly introduce Nadine and Karen, and then we'll get started with the actual presentation. Nadine Liddy has worked in the youth and multicultural sectors for almost 3 decades and is a passionate advocate for refugee and migrant youth rights. With extensive experience in forced migration, settlement and youth work, her expertise sits across policy, advocacy, service delivery and sector development in the Australian and global context. This includes developing Australia's first national youth settlement framework, which we'll discuss today, contributing to national research projects and publishing articles, leading global advocacy on refugee youth rights and supporting youth participation in national, regional and global opportunities. Thank you as well, Nadine, for joining us today, and I'm looking forward to your presentation. And lastly, we have Karen. Karen is a youth settlement, works in the youth settlement area for Multicultural Futures WA. Her work in the youth sector has taken her from Hobart to Melbourne and most recently Perth, providing support to young people from a school-based office and is a member of the MYAN WA executive group. Karen is an avid believer in the importance of youth-centred practice and a passionate advocate for the voices of young people from refugee and migrant backgrounds. So thank you so much, Karen, and really looking forward to, I guess, the insight of how this framework can actually be practically applied in set service delivery. So firstly, we'll have Carmel speak and present to us. But before that, I would just like to mention and remind everyone to please send through any questions through the question box. And we will ask these at the end of the presentations. Carmel, I would now like to ask you to open by sharing a bit about the MYAN National Youth Settlement Framework more broadly.
Right. Thank you, Sam. I hope you can hear me all. I've taken my headphones out to make it a bit easier. Okay, thank you for that lovely introduction, even though it was a way too long bio, so we need to do something about shortening that. Can I start by also acknowledging that we are on the land of the Kulin Nation. I'm in Victoria, the leper state of Australia at the moment. I'm on the land of the Wurundjeri people, which is by the banks of the Merri Creek. And I want to pay my respects to any elders past in the room and to acknowledge that we have a long way to go to reconcile with the First Nations people. Thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you for MCA for putting this together. My job today is hopefully just to provide some insight into the who is MYAN, what do we do, why did we create this framework, then Nadine's going to take you through what the framework looks like, and we're great that Karen is going to talk about how she's utilised it. So from that, I'm hoping you'll get a picture of how this kind of resource can be used, and I'm really keen, like I'm sure Nadine and Karen are, to hear from you for questions that you want to ask. We really want to make this as engaging as possible. So first of all, because I have no idea who's listening, I'm going to start with that. Some of you may not be from Victoria, may not know who we are. So the Centre for Multicultural Youth is a youth specialist multicultural agency that's been around for over 30 years. We do a breadth of work in Victoria, everything from direct service casework with young people to group work to a range of capacity building work to policy and advocacy. And I'm really pleased that in Victoria we were the first state to get funded, and the state government is a big supporter of the work we do. But so that's my daytime paid job. The other bit of my work, which is really very excited and I'm passionate and privileged to be, is the chair of MYAN, the national body that Nadine leads as its national manager. And MYAN in one form or another has existed for close to 10 years. It existed really early on with just a number of people, including myself and a number of colleagues, of which some may be on this call, some may not, who really got together to think about how we create a national vehicle for these kind of issues, because Victoria was the first of its kind, and many of the other states and the federal government were really keen on wanting to know, how do we get a nationally consistent voice around multicultural youth issues nationally? So that's how that idea started. Nadine came on really early and really has helped establish it by reaching out to each of the state and territories and working with local providers in there with a real commitment to youth issues to create some kind of mechanism in each of the states. And fortunately, that's what we've now got around the country. So I'm really pleased to say that. And we have state and territory representatives. We have places like New South Wales, where there is an actual organisation. In WA, where Karen's from, we have a great infrastructure, kind of network structure. In Queensland, we've got a organisation under Access. In Tassie, we've got a network. So we've got connections right around the country. And really part of the role that has been is to really create a national vehicle for conversations about these issues. So then you might ask, because we often get asked, well, why do we need a MYAN? Why can't we work through existing structures? Good question. I think I start with that builds on an assumption that the existing system, structures, organisations we have are actually working well with this group. So I'd have to say, without being offensive to anyone on the panel, that is hit and miss, that we have really great examples around the country where you might have a really good service that does great work, but it's not consistent in any way where you can say that, multicultural young people get the kind of service they need to help build their lives in Australia, to feel connected, to really feel like they can participate. So that's where this notion started, really, where, at the moment, close to 50, I think it's about 46.7% of the youth population is of a migrant or refugee background, maybe meaning they were either born overseas, their parents born overseas, or have an ancestry. So really 10 years ago when we started, that figure might have been closer to 30. We've now moved to a position where really this is the norm. These young people are part of the Australian community, but yet we know they're not getting equal access to services. They're not necessarily being given the kind of opportunity to participate. So that's the kind of context that we're kind of in. Of course, most of you are settlement services will know that young people under 25 have been a significant proportion of the humanitarian intake, anywhere from 25 to 30% to close to 70%. But the under 30 group generally sits pretty close to 40 to 50% on a regular basis. So we're talking about a group that constitute a significant proportion of, 1, the Australian population, 2, the humanitarian intake, and 3, the business migration, family migration program is also very youth orientated. So there might be young parents with children, but obviously they soon become teenagers, which is why that figure is close to 50% now, because large numbers and increasing numbers of birthing are coming from those communities. So you can see that, you know, and I don't need to convince anyone in this room about that, but I think it's usually really important to state that. So why do we need this multicultural youth specialist agency? One is because our settlement sector is strong. It does fabulous work in supporting communities and families settle. But historically, and I would say, and I'm happy to have this conversation later, up until recently, and I'd say the last 3 to 4 years, there really hasn't been a deliberate systemic response by the settlement sector to working with young people. They were generally seen and supported within a family context. Nothing wrong with that, because that's the way that our communities work. But what we were saying is a lot of these young people then were falling between the gaps. Now, that's not to say there were, because I know now there are a lot more. A few years ago, there weren't good individual services, but again, they weren't systemic. It wasn't necessarily recognised as an important component of settlement work. So a lot of the work MYAN's done has been to elevate that kind of conversation. And we've done a lot of advocacy, and I think we've been heard, to our credit, about really wanting to make sure, the same way that we profile women at risk and women, that you need to identify young people as a group needing specific attention. So that's the one component. Then you've got the other component, why they fall between the cracks, is then you've got a really strong youth sector. We've got a really strong youth sector in Victoria. Nadine and I are proud youth workers, still youth workers now, meaning that's where we earn our bread and butter, working with young people for many years. But the youth sector, to the same extent, had, one, historically not worked within a family context, and two, worked a lot with young people, but not necessarily very well with young people of refugee and migrant backgrounds. So again, there were great examples of organisations around the country who did that work, but it was by stealth, by accident, or because you had a really committed youth worker in that organisation or agency that did it. So if I paint that picture, you can see why there was this kind of gap. So even today, a lot of mainstream services, again, are doing fabulous programs, but if we look at Headspace is a national program. Less than 20% of their service intake are young people of refugee and migrant backgrounds. Now, that's a stunning figure, less than 20%. I can't remember, Nadine might remember the exact, but it's quite low. But yet Headspace is held up, and I think it is a fabulous national program, but yet its service model to this group is poor. Now, to their credit, they've had numerous conversations, and in conversation with CNY and our other state partners and MYAN, about what can they do to make their service more accessible. That's the kind of work MYAN wants to work on, and that's part of the reason why MYAN and its state and territory affiliates like me and the service we do exist. So moving on for that, what does a multicultural youth specialist approach mean? It means that you need to have a clear consideration of young people's needs outside of the context of their family. So within our multicultural communities, we all know family and community intersect with young people. But in this context, we also need to recognise that young people need to be seen within individuals within the family. That's what the multicultural specialist approach means, in essence, that we need to look at that and ensure it's integrated into whatever work we do. And often that means working alongside family services, working alongside community services, just ensuring that kind of analysis is there. And I've just got a few more things to say before I hand over, 3 more points. One is that we have to acknowledge that, you know, MYAN, and many of you would not know, MYAN is recognised internationally as best practice. There are no other MYANs, there are no other CMYs or MYAN New South Wales or my TAS, my MYAN, all our partners that exist anywhere else. It really is a opportunity that we were able to establish this structure because I think of the strength of the settlement sector and services like yourselves and the government's commitment to multiculturalism, and knowing that you needed government intervention to support communities to integrate and find a place. That, they have invested in a MYAN, and we need to say both sides of government have invested in MYAN. We were funded under a Labor government, then funded under Liberal, funded under Labor, back under Liberal. So I think that it's been a very bipartisan approach, and we're really proud to see that we've worked really hard to get both sides of government to see that there is important investment in a national mechanism to help young people settle in Australia, because obviously they then support the families to settle. So I think that's really important, and that we're now recognised and seen as a national body is I think a testament to the work that all our partners do in the States as well. And on that, we're recognised internationally. Nadine has done significant work through UNHCR, through other international bodies in sharing the knowledge we've got. So the kind of programs that are delivered in Australia have been documented and shared internationally as a way of showing other states and countries how you can engage in youth work practice with young people. And a lot of that's come from two levels. One, from giving voice to young people and how do you develop young people's voices in that context. And the other part is how do you support civil society work in ways to assist young people to really integrate into the community. So again, that's been really important work that, you know, we've been able to share, but it's actually relied, all we've done is shared the work that has occurred in the states and territories that people have done that we've had access to through our state partners. So from that led us to want to develop the framework that you've hopefully seen, and then Nadine will take you through, as a tool to assist services, those that really have no idea what, you know, integrating this program would be, to also great services like Karen's and others that actually know the issues, know the group, but needed tools to help them help other sectors and agencies to know how to do this work. So we think it's a really useful tool. Of course, I would say that as chair of MYAN, but I think the feedback's been pretty constructive. So we've reviewed it, and Nadine and the team and others have done a second edition, which she's going to talk to you about today, because we think that tool is really important way to really ensure young people feel like they are part of the settlement, you know, system, that they feel connected into civil society and really have every opportunity to contribute. So probably the final statement I would make on that is, at the way, in light of the pandemic across Australia, I think we have reflected at MYAN that this work becomes even more important when the young people we are all working with and their families are undoubtedly going to be affected by the downturn in the economy generally. So the young people and families that are here are going to bear a fair brunt of the economic downturn. So these tools become really important to help communities, services, government and agency think about how they, you know, they can include these young people and see them really as a strength, as adding value and the incredible resilience they bring, that this tool becomes essential, hopefully for all of you and for the other services you come in contact with. So I think I went over my 7 minutes, Nadine, so apologies. So thank you for the opportunity, Sam, and really looking forward to some kind of dialogue later. So I will hand over to Nadine.
Thank you so much, Carmel, for that broad overview, and yeah, looking at this necessity for a specific multicultural youth approach. We'll now have Nadine sharing more about the actual framework and what it looks like, yeah, all to you, Nadine.
Thanks, Sam. Great. So just bear with me a moment. I'm just going to pull up some slides. Great. Thanks, Carmel, for that context. And I'm really glad you highlighted the significance of the work that we all do in the youth settlement space internationally. And I'd certainly want to acknowledge the investment that, as you flagged, Carmel, the investment that the Australian government makes in youth settlement. It really is unparalleled globally. So you know, praise where it's due. Well and truly, there's a lot of great work that happens in Australia that is unparalleled globally, and the framework is one of them. So I'm going to talk reasonably briefly about the various components of the framework. I'm mindful that we launched this a few weeks ago now, perhaps it's a month ago. Like many of us, the weeks are rolling into whatever that is, COVID time frame. Recently, we launched this new version of the framework. So I'm mindful that some of you may have joined that event. I'm going to run through some of the content that I shared at that time, but I'm going to provide a little bit more detail with a little bit of focus on some of the tools. And then Karen is going to provide a really fantastic practical lens on using the framework in her work in her organisation. So what is the framework? It's a comprehensive resource guide. We're really mindful that the word framework can go either way for a lot of people. Sometimes there are those who love it, give me a framework to pop all my work into the bits and pieces and use it as a reference. And for others, it can feel a bit overwhelming. I think the sort of assumption is that there's a lot of conceptual content that you have to kind of navigate through to get to the practical pieces. We're really hoping that this framework, and it's very much intentional, brings those two things together. So it's intentionally a comprehensive conceptual and practical guide for supporting good practice with young people from refugee and migrant backgrounds. It's absolutely been informed by the sector, so work on the ground in the broader youth sector and in the settlement space. Also by young people. We did consultations to inform the framework when it was first released, and have done consultations in the revised, to develop the revised version with young people in our networks and also with government. And in the development of this new version, we did very much go back out to the sector. We really wanted to check in with all of you out there. And by the sector, I mean that very broadly, the settlement sector, the youth sector, and everything in between. And we know that it's been used by health services, in mental health spaces, again in youth settlement specific, in the training and education space, etc., etc. And I'll talk a little bit about that towards the end of my presentation. So it's very much been informed by work on the ground. These are the 5 key components. It presents information around the youth settlement context, youth work in Australia, and that's a new chapter that we included in this version. It's framed around active citizenship with a set of domains and indicators to very practically guide work on the ground. There's a set of 13 good practice capabilities, which I'll talk through in a moment. And we've added, and there's new 3 good practice capabilities, and there's 4 practice tools and a set of useful resources that's in one document. As Carmel has flagged, it certainly builds on and benchmarks good practice. So it's very intentionally designed to set a benchmark of what good practice is in all its various components, and to a degree, a level of complexity in that good practice. But we certainly think that active citizenship framing with the domains, the indicators, and the good practice capabilities are the ways of making that meaningful and easy to navigate through. And as I've said, it has application in practice across sectors nationally. And since it was first released in 2016, we have implemented it through a whole range of training workshops and other professional development, some national webinars that we've run with Institute of Family Studies, and at the state and territory level through our partner organisations, there's been a whole range of training workshops that happen at that level. And we will continue to do that with the rollout of this new version. I don't know if, great. There was a bit of freezing there. This diagram on the left is one of the new tools that we've developed. So we also have smartened up the design in this new version. It was looking a little bit tired. So it should look a whole lot snappier this time around. And we created what we're calling as a poster, this diagram on the left, to really talk through what the framework is. And what we heard really loud and clear from the sector and practitioners on the ground are you guys wanted some tools that you could easily pull out and stick on your walls and be able to share with colleagues, really sort of quick and easy reference points around the key components of the framework. So that's one of the tools we've developed. I've talked through most of these things. The three new good practice capabilities are rights-based, reflective practice, and outcomes-focused. And what I didn't mention is the strengthening the rights-based approach. Again, that's some feedback that we had from the sector and also from young people. So we have strengthened that framing in the document and also included some international information and some comparison. There is the list of the good practice capabilities. I'm certainly not going to talk through all of those. There are 13, which we were a little bit concerned about when we were developing this 2020 edition. But some of the feedback we had was that we should be separating out a couple of those capabilities that were combined. So I think we had youth-centred and youth participation, and certainly the feedback we had is that they are two very different concepts and ought to be separated and therefore receiving the attention that they needed as specific ways of working. So we separated a couple of those capabilities, and then the three new ones are those at the bottom. And also the feedback we had on the 13, and I must say we did try and keep it to 10, but someone did say, no, 13 is good because it's not an even number. She suggested that there's some marketing tool around odd numbers. So we hope that works. We're mindful that there are quite a few, but once again, to support it in practice, we've developed some really clear guidance. This is one of the diagrams that existed prior in the 2016 version, and we've just kind of snapping that up. So that is a really quick snapshot of the active citizenship domains and indicators. There are 4 domains: economic, social, civic participation, and personal wellbeing, with the result being active citizenship. And within each of those domains, there are a set of indicators. A couple of things I will say about this framing. We utilised, when we developed it in 2016, we utilised government settlement frameworks at the time and adapted it to the youth context. And again, based on the feedback that we had from the sector and others, we didn't change this framing. The feedback that we received was loud and clear that this was a really helpful framing, and the domains are intended to be sort of areas of a young person's life, with those indicators being particular skills or capabilities that young people need to be supported to develop to achieve active citizenship. And I should say 2 key elements in this that we talk about in the framework are fundamental to active citizenship is building social capital and agency. And I would reinforce again that this isn't just what we have done with the framework, is not just take a broader settlement framing and put a few things in. We have very intentionally thought about the context for young people in settlement, and we know that they experience settlement differently to adults and younger children, and Carmel talked a little bit about that. It's because of their age, that really critical developmental stage of adolescence that they are negotiating alongside all of those stresses and major transitions that settlement presents. they also play a really critical role in supporting the settlement of their families. So there are some particular experiences in the settlement context that young people have, and that's what this picks up on and is based on. And the good practice capabilities are there on the left. So this is a new diagram. We're replacing the one that sort of pulled it all together in 2016. We had some really clear feedback that that was confusing and not very aesthetically nice. So we've scrapped that and replaced it with this one, which we do think presents in a bit more of a sort of logical, linear fashion, the various components of the framework. And those good practice capabilities are intended to be applied at the practice level, so at the service delivery level, across those 4 domains, addressing each of those indicators, and the result is active citizenship for young people. And one really important thing that I will say about what I've just described is that is in no way suggesting that settlement is a nice, neat, linear process. Really want to say that loud and clear. It's a really complex process that everybody who goes through that navigates in their own way at their own time. And it's complex because for young people, they're navigating multiple factors, multiple transitions that are more complex than their Australian-born non-immigrant peers, more complex because of those issues around belonging and identity, finding your place in the world, working out who you are within yourself, within your family, within your community, within the broader Australian society, and what all of that looks like in the context of migration or forced migration. So there is a lot going on, and young people will navigate this in more of a circular way. Often when I've delivered workshops on this with a whiteboard, I've drawn a squiggly line through that. It can be a long and complex journey for some young people who will need particular support at particular times in each of those domains. And for other young people, it can be a lot more straightforward. These are the supplementary resources, so the 5 supplementary resources. Those on the left are guides to applying, sorry, I'll start at the top row actually. The applying active citizenship indicators to practice and the good practice capabilities are documents that provide a lot more detail about each of those areas and exactly what it means in practice. And then at the bottom are the assessment guides, and Karen's going to talk a little bit more about that. And the other document is the useful resources. This is just an example of the assessment guides, but I might leave it up if you want me to, Karen, but I'll just finish off. Karen will talk about exactly how the framework's been applied in practice in her setting, but we do know, again, from feedback and our engagement with the sector across the country, that it's been used in the policy setting by government. It's used at the service delivery level across sectors, as I mentioned before, in the education and training space, in community health, in settlement-specific organisations, in mainstream youth services, to really guide service design, delivery and evaluation, which we're really pleased about. It's probably no big news for most of you joining us today, but there's a lot of work we need to do around measuring settlement outcomes, and certainly the intent of the framework is to assist in that work. And the last thing I'll say is that as I flagged at the launch, and you may have seen if you're on our mailing list, we will be rolling out a whole range of training workshops and professional development at the national level through some webinars and other interactive workshops, and then of course through our partners across the country in each of the states and territories. So stay tuned and look out for the rollout of that work, and that will probably happen over the next 3 months. And there will be a whole range of events that will support the rollout of the 2020 version. I'm going to leave it there and hand over to Karen. Do you want me to leave up those slides, Karen, or not?
Will you be able to move them for me, Nadine, if I need to? I'm not sure I'm going to go.
And don't worry, everyone, I don't mean running through all the slides one more time. I just mean, do you want me to leave the assessment guide up?
Actually, I might go to the good practice capabilities slide if you don't mind. I might forget it's there after a while though. So yes, thank you. Oh, the next one. Yes, thank you.
Great.
Fantastic. That covers almost everything. Good morning, everybody in Western Australia. Good afternoon, everybody else. I firstly want to acknowledge that today I'm privileged to be on the beautiful traditional lands of the Whadjuk Noongar people and pay my respect to their elders past and present, and acknowledge also the ongoing capability, strength and resilience of the culture and the people. Thank you for having me here today and to speak about some of my experiences. I love the National Youth Settlement Framework. I love that it gives me a framework to what I'm sure many of you can agree with me that our work can be very, it's intense and it's ongoing and it's always moving. So it's really great to have a framework that you can sit your work around. So I just want to speak a little bit about its relevance to my work, and I hope that that will be able to help others to see how they can apply it in your setting. So firstly, I just wanted to mention 3 ways that I do use it quite a lot. And firstly is as an ongoing reflection tool, evaluation tool, planning tool. And this is, again, where those traffic lights, which I know Nadine's had up before, but they're fantastic. Love the traffic lights. The really important thing about the framework is that it's not a one-off, it's an ongoing thing that you can apply. So where the good practice capabilities and the domain indicators that we've got there work really well is that whether you're doing a little bit of personal reflection on what's happening in your casework or what's happening in your office, or whether you're planning for a funding grant that you're putting in for, or a program, or evaluating something formally, you've got something to come back to. And one of the ways that I reflect on it in my own practice is just seeing where the work is sitting that I'm doing. And I think this is important, not just from a good outcome perspective, but also from a self-care perspective, because when we keep our work within a particular area and it becomes quite small, sometimes that can be really exhausting, and from a health perspective as a worker it can wear us down. So if you look across the whole realm of capabilities and domain indicators, for example, civic participation, seeing young people involved in community leadership and different things is really buoying for your work. It makes you feel like you can really see the outcomes, whereas other work like continually working within the economic participation area can actually be exhausting. So you can see that if you can get a balance across those areas in your work, it's a really great way to reflect on what you're doing, that you're actually just putting effort and planning into all of those different domains and indicators. The other thing that's really important and useful about the framework, I think that all people that work within the SETS area would know that we do a lot of informal coaching and teaching. So people that we come across, I've got quite a unique setting in that I work for a not-for-profit, Multicultural Futures. I work in the SETS area, but I'm based in a school, so I'm working with the education department, who have a completely different approach to the work that they do. So what the National Youth Settlement Framework provides me with is a language. So when I'm doing that informal coaching or that informal teaching around what is best practice with the people that I'm working with, I've got a language to fall back on. Now, some of those people might have participated in the training and are actually familiar with it, others aren't, but it's a really simple language to use. So then you can kind of weave it into your conversations, and then you have the opportunity to say, oh, do you want me to email on the link to that later so you can have another look at it when you're planning for that program or you're planning for what we're doing. So an example that I can think about with that is one of the very embedded celebrations that has happened in the school where I work for many years is Harmony Day, and it had always been organised by a group of teachers. And even though we've got this incredible group of young adults with amazing ideas and cultural experiences, they'd never been drawn on to actually ask how that event would look. So when I was asked about my involvement in it very early in my time at the school, I was able to straight away refer to the youth settlement framework and how are young people participating in this, and in what way are we acknowledging their cultural experiences. So that's just a simple example of how you can use the language from the framework. The other main thing, so as a reflection evaluation planning tool, as a language to refer back to, but probably the main thing about the framework is that it's not a competency list of competencies that you can tick off and move on from. It is a framework, and what's great about a framework is that it's something that's agile, it's something that's dynamic, it's something that can be moved from different contexts in order to meet different needs. So the surprise appearance of COVID-19 into our world this year is a great example of this. We couldn't have planned for this last year, and here it is. So immediately we can apply the framework to changes that we had to make. And now I know many people that are watching or listening this morning probably had to move your service in some way. I'm sure everybody did. So when you're moving your service, immediately you can refer back to the framework and start to look through those competencies. And can I just say, it might not be that you have to apply all those 13 every time either. It's just, they're little grab points. You can grab them and go, okay, are we being youth-centred in how we're redesigning our service delivery? Are we actually asking the young people what they need? Are we assuming that they want us to jump on social media and reach them that way? Have we actually asked the young people what is it that they need from us? Are we assuming that they all want computers in their houses? I'm sure the answer is probably yes, but you can't assume that without asking the young people first. So it's a great example of how that framework can just move into different settings. And like I said, it's not something that you tick once. You can look at the traffic lights, for example. We might be looking at strength-based. Are we being strength-based in how we're delivering our casework on a day-to-day basis? And it might be, yeah, you can move on to that if you like, Nadine. I keep forgetting it's there. So you might look at the traffic lights for your casework and go, yes, we're being strength-based. We're not just handing out. We're not just doing the work for them. We're working with the strengths of the young people when we're delivering our casework. And you might get a green traffic light and move on. But then you might come back when you're developing a program that you've had for a long time that's always worked and you've had great feedback from other service providers or teachers. But when you look at the fact of whether you're being strength-based, you might see suddenly that actually it's an orange traffic light or a red traffic light. So the framework has this great ability to be able to be applied in different contexts and be very agile to what gets thrown at us in our work. And I'm very aware that we're moving into a time that's hard to predict as well in the future, even as COVID-19 becomes something that's hopefully managed. We're still going to be looking at an economic flow through that's going to be devastating for a lot of people that we work with through, and we can't possibly predict all the challenges that we have again, but this framework is going to be able to be applied across that regardless. One of the examples that I've used before to explain how the framework works, and some of us are more structured in how we work, and others of us are probably a little bit more flexible, I'm going to say, about myself. We could also call it chaotic, but the framework provides a really neat structure that we can keep referring back to. And if you think about how you shop, some people may eat the same food every single week, but a lot of people don't work that way. And your menu can shift without changing the framework from which you eat. So you might work off the fact that you're going to have, your 5 serves of veggies and your 2 serves of fruit a day and some protein, and those things stay the same, but how you serve that up on your plate can look very different from day to day. So whether you're the sort of person that sticks to the same menu all the time at home, or whether you change it all up, it doesn't have to shift the framework. So what's great about having a framework. And again, it's something that can be really, really agile. And I'd really encourage anybody that hasn't really looked at it, or is new to it, or maybe is familiar with it but hasn't known how to apply it, that it really is a work of discovery. So it's not something that you have to read from front to back, although if you know you can sit through a workshop or do something like that, it's great. It's not something that you have to complete like a module in a university degree. It's something that can be discovered as you're working, and as you apply your work to different contexts, it will look different. So it doesn't have to be, you know, it's not a work of fiction that you start at the beginning and you finish. You pick up what's applicable to what you're designing at that time, and then, you know, come back to it again and again. So, and you actually retain the practice. So the way it's so embedded in my brain now is just through outworking. So the more you outwork it and the more you go back and reflect on it, the more it just becomes a part of your language and your immediate response to anything that you're doing. I've got no idea how long I've been talking for. Sorry, is it time to finish?
No,
you don't need to nail it all at once, is what I'm saying. It's a work of discovery.
No, you're more than welcome to keep going, Karen. We've still got over a half an hour, so yeah.
Oh, okay, great.
If you've got more to add, please don't feel rushed.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I just didn't look at the clock when I started. So, yeah, so again, it's just something that you can discover as you go and keep coming back to.
Wonderful.
Can I just jump in, Sam, there?
Yeah, please.
To build on what you were saying, Karen. I'm really glad you've taken that angle, because once again, I think sometimes some people see it as a bit daunting, and the assessment guides, you know, it's long and the traffic lights are a bit off-putting. But I think some of that is it's sort of a fear of judgment, and really there is no intent here. This is about reflective practice, and a tool designed to have a think about what you do. And when I've run workshops with teams and organisations, actually the assessment guides have been a great tool to have great conversations about practice. So I've often said it doesn't matter if you don't get through it all, because people have sort of opened up the pages and felt a bit overwhelmed by, you know, how many pages and how many good practice capabilities and how many indicators and domains. And my response has been, you know, you can take it bit by bit. And I like your angle, Karen, about sort of dipping in and out of it, and it being an agile piece, which is really great around reflective practice, but uses it as a tool to generate some conversations and reflection that you may not otherwise have. That it doesn't matter if you don't fill in the right-hand column, but if you've had some great conversations about the work that you're doing on the ground and got some new ideas on that, great. That's a great outcome of using the assessment guides.
Absolutely, Nadine, I agree with all of that. And if I can refer again to the fact that I'm working across two very different sectors, from a not-for-profit in the education department, and any of you who've had experience in both of those would know that the operation is very different. And that's where, again, the language, it's not that I have no expectation that every staff member of that school will sit through a training for the National Youth. It's just not going to happen. Practically, some people don't want to, some people don't see the need for it, and others just won't make the time for it. But I have the opportunity just to weave the language in so that people can actually pick up on the value of some of these capabilities without actually having to sit in the training. And like I said before, I know sex workers, we're constantly doing that sort of informal coaching and training. So it just gives you a really great language to go back to. And you might even be thinking, oh, wow, you know, this group that I'm working with, they really, if I was to evaluate them, they're on a red traffic light for being trauma informed, for example. And I really would like to work with them around that. So you can have that in the back of your mind without actually even sitting with the paper in front of your mind. You can just have that in the back of your mind when you're talking with them about something that you're developing together, or something that one of your clients might be accessing or working with. So
it's a good advocacy tool too, yes. Karen. That's what I'm hearing as an advocacy organisation. And of course, that doesn't need to be really big picture or big campaigns. It's the work that you're all doing in your day-to-day work on the ground.
Yeah, absolutely. And it does sound like something formal that should be acknowledged. As soon as you say the National Youth Settlement Framework, people's immediate response is, well, that sounds like something that we're meant to be working towards. So there's some, you know, immediately, even if someone isn't familiar with MYAN as such, or any of the best practices, they can acknowledge that that sounds like an official framework that she's mentioning. So I should listen, possibly.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Karen and Nadine, for sharing more about the framework and how it can actually be practically applied to service delivery. We'll now move on to questions. Just a reminder, if you have any questions, to please send them through the question box at the bottom. We've got a couple of questions that have already been sent through, so I'll read those out, and whoever would like to answer, please feel free to answer. So the first question we have is, are there any external factors to the model proposed that can impact on the ability to achieve active citizenship? What should we do when applying these things? What should we do when we are applying these things but still not achieving active citizenship?
Karen, do you want to respond from a practice level? I can also respond. It's not an entirely new question, but I just wonder, Karen, your perspective from on the ground might be great.
So actually, Samantha, would I possibly better read that question? I just didn't pick it all up. Is it in the Q&A? Can I?
Sure. No, it's been emailed to me, and I don't think I can copy and paste it in.
Possibly, if you could repeat it again. Sorry,
yeah,
everybody.
No problems. So it's, are there external factors to the model that can impact on the ability to achieve active participation? What should we do when applying these things? What should we do when we are applying these things but are still not achieving active participation? Active citizenship, sorry.
Sure. Look, it's obviously the first thing that comes to mind with me is that young people have very different experiences in settlement and prior to living in Australia, and also their family context. So there's going to be a lot of different factors that are going on outside that are going to impact on whether or not they want to participate in anything civic. And there's some young people, for example, there'll be a lot of young women I find that feel a lot more responsibility at home, so they feel like they can't put their hand up for anything outside of school and home. And there's other young people that, you know, they're just dealing with different things in their life and it's not on the agenda at the moment. So there are some young people that are primed for it and other young people that it's just not there in their stage of life. So I guess that's where the focus comes back to strengths-based and also empowering young people, because if you're hearing their voice, you have an opportunity to teach them or show them that actually even by giving their feedback, they're actually influencing things on a civic level. So for example, MYAN WA recently did some work on just finding out what young people's experience was during COVID and how they'd been impacted. And there was one particular young woman that I'd worked for quite a while, and I'd really wanted her to see her potential to be able to participate in a sort of broader community capacity, but she'd always felt like she couldn't. But in this case, all she had to do was to join in to this Zoom chat and actually tell them what her experiences had been. So she was willing to do that. So sometimes it's about just looking for those opportunities and matching them with the young people where they're at. And it might not be that they won't participate at this level, but maybe you can find something here for them just by listening for them or asking them and making sure they understand that that actually is making a big difference, what they're doing, just by even giving that feedback to you. I might think of something else in the minute after Nadine spoke, maybe.
No, wonderful. Thanks, Karen. Nadine?
Look, I think the answer is yes.
Yeah.
There are, and the first thing that comes to my mind are structural barriers like racism and discrimination. They are big, deep-seated, long-standing factors that are very detrimental on young people's lives. But I would then draw us back to the good practice capabilities, and one of those is around advocacy. So we certainly provide in the framework some guidance around addressing what I might describe as structural barriers. So what are those external factors? I think structural barriers fit into that category. And I think, service access to mainstream services, Carmel talked about mental health services. How do we, they are big. Access and equity factors, again, are deep-seated and often long-standing inequities and disadvantage for this group of young people. How do we address that? We don't have to necessarily go with addressing big government policies, although they may also be external factors. What can we do? What can we control and what can we influence in the work that we're doing? And that might be conversations with your local Headspace organisation to shift their practice on the ground. So I think definitely yes. I also think the framework provides some guidance about how to address those, but some things are really big picture and they are long-standing, and often it's lifetimes of work to influence government policies or other more entrenched factors.
Absolutely. Thanks, Nadine. Carmel, did you have anything you wanted to add on that question?
I think Nadine answered it, and I think a good way to reflect on that as a worker on the ground too is sometimes it can feel overwhelming, all-encompassing, that young people can't have access. So sometimes we need to work at a kind of systems level, but also feel like you can do something in your own community. So yes, as Nadine referenced, that's what I was going to say. We need to look at the barriers to access and participation and work on those, whether it's within giving voice in your own community, to giving voice in your own agency, and then working with others, which is why the MYAN structures are important, like Karen referenced, MYAN, that you can work as a group and feel like you can change some of those structures, because you always can't do it alone.
Absolutely. Thanks everyone. Next question, can you provide more information about the outcomes focused practice, good practice capability? So I know that this is something that has been talked about a lot in settlement recently, is how do you track outcomes and what does outcomes actually look like? So would love everyone's insights on this, if you have anything to say about it. I think Nadine's having some technical issues, so I'm not sure if Karen or Carmel would like to start.
Yeah, I'm happy to start, but I'm wondering whether, Karen, do you want to talk about what you do locally, and I'm happy to then talk about what we see at a more kind of organisational level.
Yeah, sure. So I was just looking back at the slide that Nadine had up before, but with the capabilities and the good practice capabilities and sorry, I'm just trying to find the right name, but the different domains of participation. And again, that's where reflecting on those things is a really good way to see how outcomes based you're being. So obviously we all have our different ways of reporting, and sometimes that reporting really doesn't show what work's being done on a ground level. It's not a good way to reflect on it, and that's again where the framework's really a much more accurate way to evaluate whether your work's being effective. So again, you can look at economic participation and see, what outcomes are coming from the work that we're doing. So it's really quite simple to be able to measure what you're doing and saying, yes, is it increasing economic participation? Is the work we're doing, is it just band-aiding things, or is it actually providing ways for young people to have greater economic participation? Social participation, again, measuring, what are the outcomes from the work that we're doing. Civic participation, which we were just discussing, what can we measure to see how the young people that are accessing our service, or we're providing casework for, that they're actually they're finding opportunities for civic participation and the confidence to be able to do that, personal wellbeing again, active citizenship. So all of those domains of participation are really good ways to measure your work in the context of being outcome-based. And I think, you know, everyone would understand that sometimes the way we need to report to our funding managers, it doesn't always reflect that in a true sense. So that's where, again, the framework can be really just such a powerful way to evaluate the effectiveness of what we're doing and whether we are actually outcome-based in what we're doing.
Absolutely. Thanks, Karen. Carmel or Nadine? I'm not sure if Nadine, you can hear us.
If you want to talk about some of the outcome stuff, Nadine, yeah.
What was the question? I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. So can you provide more information about the outcomes focused good practice capability?
Okay. I mean, a little bit. It's a new one, and again, it came through the feedback that we had from the sector. I think, as I flagged before, there's a lot of work that we need to do. I think certainly in settlement services, I think other sectors do this work better, but there's a lot of work to do. So I'm not in a position to talk about how that capability has been applied in practice, though you've given some examples, Karen. I think there's work to do. And what I would say is it can often feel like it's complex work. So again, a lot of practitioners feel like it's quite complex and outside the scope of their work, but we would argue that it's not, and that the guidance that we provide is to make it very tangible and practical in the sort of day-to-day work that you do. And often I think practitioners on the ground have the best sort of optics or the best line of sight around young people's journey in settlement in all its complexity and all its diversity. So I think sometimes it's a matter of sort of doing the work to formulate that in to actually put outcomes on the table. So rather than feeling like it's too big or it's too hard, actually there's a whole lot of great information that you have as practitioners and in your relationships with young people. So young people have that lens, actually. I think it's a matter of maybe rethinking an outcomes focus as something really tangible and something that we can do better at day to day.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Nadine. Carmel, anything else to add? No? Great. We'll just move on to the next question. So we have a question here saying, what scope is there for called community organisations to work in conjunction with MYAN for youth development in a particular community?
I'm just going to jump in, but I think given the work of both Carmel CMY, on the ground, and Karen, your work on the ground, I think you're better placed to answer that. But straight up, I would say there's lots of scope. Actually, often I'm asked about the youth work concept with young people from refugee and migrant backgrounds from CALD communities. And there is a lot of, sometimes there is a level of mistrust and caution around youth work and youth work practice in CALD communities, because there is an assumption that the focus is on the young people and there is a strong focus on youth rights, and actually that disregards the family and community context. So I'm not sure if this is somewhere in the background to this question, but I think what I always say is that that is not good youth work practice with young people from refugee and migrant backgrounds. Good youth work practice, which is captured in the framework, is about working at the individual, family and community level, and family aware is one of those good practice capabilities. Cultural competence is one of the good practice capabilities. I think there's a lot of scope to work with. If the question is about CALD specific organisations, a whole lot of scope, and we should all actually be on the same page on this. How do we bring practice together to do good work. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thanks, Nadine. Carmel?
I might answer something there and say, look, absolutely, because my work as a youth worker in the 90s was as a multicultural youth worker in an organisation where I was the only person talking about young people. So some of these issues have been there for a long time, and I think that, yes, there is scope to talk to other people in your state or your region. So maybe if you pop Nadine an email, we can try and then connect you with the right people in whichever state you're in to have that conversation, because I think it's really important for MYAN and its networks to really be working effectively with the mainstream, with settlement services, and with whatever kind of cold organisations exist. So I think that, we'd be really happy to kind of try and see if we can do some introductions to people that might be able to support you.
And Sam, can I just jump back boldly to that question about outcomes? Because I'm really glad it's come up, and we don't, as we've all sort of said, we don't give near enough attention to it. I think the other thing to say is measuring outcomes and capturing outcomes, whether it's in a more comprehensive tool or documented in a really comprehensive way, or whether it is in some case studies using some of those indicators, it is really critical for building an evidence base and the advocacy work that I think we all do at different levels around the importance of settlement work and youth settlement. So I think it's really important as a sector that we invest in that area, because we don't have a great evidence base around that, and it is really critical for advocacy around, to government in particular, but also to the broader community around why maintain, and particularly maybe in this context, why maintain a humanitarian program? What is the value of migration? Well, these are the outcomes. This group of young people come here with strengths, capabilities. We know they are highly aspirational, etc., etc. They play critical roles in supporting their family and community. Have we got that captured somewhere? And have we documented, a journey for a young person through those, initial, often intense needs in the settlement journey, through to kind of 3 to 5 to 10 years down the track, and everything in between? I think we really need to invest in doing that work, capturing it and getting it out there.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thanks, Nadine. Thank you for that. Next question is, where can we learn more? For example, training. And I think this was mentioned before that there's going to be some workshops rolled out. So if we can have a bit more information about that, that would be wonderful.
I think that's me again.
Sorry, Nadine.
No worries. No, all good. All good. And this is the really exciting part, really, is getting it out there and talking to everyone on the ground, unpacking it, workshopping it. We will be doing some, what I've called webinars, but we're hoping to have a really interactive webinars, online events at the national level that might also bring together researchers and policymakers and service providers and young people to explore what the framework means, and that will be complementing workshops on the ground. In the current context, we are doing a lot of work to adapt our training materials to an online methodology, so it's likely that a lot of the workshops will happen online. And given that context, for any of you who are familiar with how the framework's been rolled out over the last 4 years, again, most of the work has happened at the state and territory level, where there's been 1-day training or 2-day training followed up by sort of half-day training or workshops with organisations. Obviously, with the online methodology, it might be that we run, a series of workshops that make up a day's training. So we're looking at how we adapt and expand on the existing modules that we have to make it much more interactive and appropriate to the current context. And look, ideally there will be a mix of face-to-face opportunities and some online workshops, but once again, our intent is for those to be really interactive, for people to see those workshops as opportunities to reflect and strengthen their practice.
Wonderful.
So stay tuned. That will happen over the next 3 months. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thanks, Nadine. And we will also be sharing them through our updates and through our subgroup meetings as well, so that people are aware of what's coming up.
And sorry, Sam, just because I've mentioned the state and territory partners, and Carmel, you mentioned some of those at the beginning, just to be really explicit in WA, it's MYAN WA, and I know, Karen, you sit on the executive group, and MYAN WA is auspiced by YACWA, the Youth Affairs Council of WA. In Victoria, obviously, it's CMY. In Tassie, it's MyT, which is auspiced by MRC Tasmania. New South Wales, it's MYAN New South Wales. In Queensland, it's MyPew, which is auspiced by Access Community Services. ACT, MYAN ACT, auspiced by the Youth Peak, the Youth Coalition. And NT, it's Melaleuca. So we expect that there'll be activity in all of those states and territories.
Wonderful. Thanks, Nadine. So we've got a couple of questions here that are quite similar about regional settlement and, young people in regional areas. So I guess the question is, what are the differences in experience for young people settling in regional and rural areas, and how can we actually use this framework in that context?
Can I maybe start with that, and then Karen, I know WA is one of those states with regional, so I don't know what MYAN was kind of doing there, but I noticed that there's another question there about funding in rural areas as well. So I wanted to kind of tackle both of those. Firstly, if we start with the experience of being a young person of a refugee migrant background is fundamentally the same. What plays out is the communities you live in and maybe the opportunities you've got, and that undoubtedly regional and rural Australian spots are quite different. In Melbourne, we've got some offices in what we would call rural Australia, Victoria, but when I talk with my MYAN colleagues, rural Victoria is nothing like rural WA or rural Queensland, so I'm not going to speak as an expert, but the feedback and work we've got is just the extent to which there isn't the infrastructure in lots of those towns that you get in metro cities, so that makes it difficult to get supports. Often the settlement provider or the multicultural youth worker or family worker becomes the be-all for everything, so that often might mean that their resources are tight and the kind of things you'd like to do become different. So I think that the way that you respond to the challenges are different. Some of the issues we find in our regional towns get accentuated, whether it's access to school, what happens if you want to go on to further education, TAFE or uni, the options aren't there. It means leaving rural communities, which for lots of the families we work with becomes complicated. Access to work. So all those things get really accentuated outside of Metro Melbourne. So for us, part of the work MYAN wants to do and the states do is how do we build an advocacy platform to ensure that services for young people are funded in regional and rural Australia and not just in Metro, because with the government push to rural migration, even though we don't know when migration is going to start, there are groups living out there, and the redistribution of funds to meet those needs, I think, is a challenge. And that's, we've heard that loud and clear at MYAN about how do we support these rural communities. So it's not really an answer, but it's maybe giving you some insight into some of the advocacy work we're doing at a national and state level to try and get government to be more responsive. And, to be honest, we really need to push on the state governments for some of this as well, because there is funding for regional development programs, and young people often seem to be forgotten in that picture. So I think that's where I might start, and really happy to hand it over to Karen and Nadine to add some more.
Thanks, Carmel. Karen?
Obviously, yes, the Western Australian regional context is very different to the Victorian one. And unfortunately, I don't have a lot to say other than if there is anybody listening from those regional areas in WA, please do get in touch with MYAN, because we've always endeavoured to try to connect with people in regional settings that are working in the in this sector. So we'd always be open to supporting, and we have offered regional training before in the past, so we'd really be keen to look. And we also we really try to encourage very much young people to come from regional areas to be involved in our events like Catalyst Youth, which has happened in the past, and we've had young people come from regional areas because we really want to hear those voices. They're very important. Their context is very unique. So we'd always just be open to hearing. As far as funding, it is really, without having personal experience in regional WA, I know that it is a really challenging area for people to be able to secure funding for this sort of unique work that needs to happen in those areas. So I'm not able to speak to what opportunities are there, but just to acknowledge that we're aware that it's an issue, and do get in touch.
Wonderful. Thanks, Karen. Nadine?
I just think to add, from a national perspective, and I know this is the case with our state and territory partners, I think it's always really important to be intentional about representation from regional areas for exactly the reason that you just said, Karen. And I'm wondering in the new online environment that many more people have come on board, there will be many more opportunities for those working in regional and rural areas to join in practice collegial conversations with services across locations, which ideally will help the work that they're doing in their setting, of course. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And I know that training on the framework, to be very specific, has most certainly been delivered in regional WA, in regional Queensland and regional New South Wales and regional Vic. They're just some examples off the top of my head, but we know the context is quite different. So I think the question is, how can we more support the work that happens on the ground? Because there are some real day-to-day challenges and frustrations around service accessibility and opportunities for young people. Yep. And just one other thing, Sam, just to add in terms of the workshops that we will be rolling out, what I omitted to say is we will be doing some specific work with specific settlement programs and also some specific organisations. So working with MCA around the SET COP and the youth subgroup, we'll be doing some work there. We're also probably doing some work with AMEP in particular. In the previous rollout, we did some specific work with YTS. And if any of you who are joining us today, would like MYAN to do some specific work with your organisation, that is certainly something that we have rolled out in the last 4 years. So that's certainly something that we can do, and we would be looking to our state and territory partners to adapt that and work with you. And it would be adapting the materials that we have to your particular context. So there's a lot of scope for specific and broader workshops on the framework. And the advantage with the broader is I think it brings together a whole range of practitioners, but often organisations have wanted to follow that up with some internal specific work. So all of that is possible.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Nadine. Well, I think we've got no more questions coming through. So thank you all so much. Thank you, Carmel, Nadine and Karen, for sharing with us some of the practical opportunities of using the National Youth Settlement Framework and how it can actually be applied in set service delivery. From my understanding and from what I've seen, the framework is such a valuable tool. And I think today we've really been able to highlight the necessity to focus on the key areas that are outlined in the actual tool and how it can actually assist settlement providers in supporting young people moving forward. So thank you all so much for joining in and thank you again to our guest presenters for sharing your insights. Really appreciate it.
And thanks, Sam, for hosting, and to all of you who've joined us.
Thank you, Sam.
Thank you. Take care, everyone, and stay safe. Bye.